Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's Libsyn, ads.com today.
You're listening to Campus Killings, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Below the Surface, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Amy, and welcome back, listeners. We have officially reached the end of season 4.
Wow, I can't believe that. It went so fast.
I was like, is season 4? I still somehow was in season 3, but here we are. Before we get to today's episode, I just wanted to give a major shout out to everyone who provided us case suggestions for this special season. Also, a big thank you to everyone who's dropped us a positive review, sent us fan mail, and people who continue to tune in every other Saturday. We're so, so grateful. This show definitely wouldn't be growing without you, and we can't thank you enough for your ongoing support. We really enjoyed opening up our case log to you all this season, and while next season won't be all listener suggestions, we got so many great ones that we didn't have a chance to air yet that we will continue to cover your requests in season 5. So please keep sending them our way. All right, on to our season finale. In keeping with our finale tradition, this will be a 2-part episode and focus on a historic case. Our listener, Lisa P., suggested the Kent State shootings as she has a personal connection to the event. Her grandfather was actually repairing a roof in the town of Kent as this tragedy unfolded, so she'd love for us to do the deep dive into this case. And I don't know about you, Amy, but I sometimes cover this case in my classes.
Yes, it's definitely one of the more important cases, for sure.
Right. And while some of our listeners may have living memory of the Kent State shooting in 1970, this is over 50 years ago, and we probably have a lot of listeners who may have never even heard of it. So a big thank you to Lisa for reminding us about this case. And for those of you who do know it, I'm sure there's a lot you don't actually know. I certainly didn't realize how much I didn't know about these events until I started the research. Most of the information on today's episode came from an excellent book called 67 Shots, Kent State and the End of American Innocence by Howard Means. We're going to have a link to that in our show notes for anyone who'd like to check it out. But before we unpack the tragedy, let's start with some background on Kent State itself. Created in 1910 as a normal school in the town of Kent, Ohio, to provide certified teachers to the state, the school was named after William S. Kent, the son of the town's founder. While classes began in off-site locations before construction on their own buildings had even broke ground, the school graduated its first class with just 34 students in July of 1914. And by the 1920s, the school, which now hosted several buildings just outside the town, offered 4-year degrees and saw the largest enrollment of any teacher training college in the nation. Yeah, This growth continued through the next 30 years, and by the 50s, Kent was able to expand to several satellite locations throughout Ohio. By the 1970s, they had 8 new colleges under the Kent University umbrella and became an R2 research university, with much of their faculty doing research in the sciences. One of their largest claims to fame came in 1965 with the establishment of the Liquid Crystal Institute. So liquid crystals are most commonly used in flat panel electronics like our phones, tablets, computers, TVs. It makes sense now, though, if you think about it, like anything that's LCD, liquid crystal. So in the early 60s, this technology was being considered for replacing the vacuum tubes that were used in TVs. So many of the breakthroughs in the everyday applications of LCs have been made through Kent's Institute, and they're currently a world leader in what has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, since its inception in 1965, 10 spin-off LC companies have emerged from the research and experiments performed in the Kent labs. How cool, right? But that's not the only fun fact about Kent, although this one may be less impressive. While LC technology takes precedence at the university, there is one other defining feature of Kent, aside from the event we're about to discuss, and that is their unofficial mascot, the black squirrel. In the early 1960s, Kent's head groundskeeper learned that Ohio's black squirrel population was in serious decline due to an increase in predators. So in an effort to restore the population, he ordered 10 squirrels from Ontario, Canada, and released them onto the campus where he hoped they would help repopulate the species. And they did. By 1970, there were over 150 squirrels on the campus. And since then, they have multiplied tenfold and become entirely integrated into the ecosystem. They've become such an icon for both the town and school that the university hosts an annual Black Squirrel Festival every fall in their honor.
We're going.
I know.
That's going to be our next company retreat.
I know. It sounds so cute. And while Kent may be on the map for their cute squirrels and important research, they are also infamous for the events of May 4th, 1970, when the Ohio National Guard gunned down student protesters on the campus's front lawn. It's important to note that this was not the first time the U.S. military shot protesting students. The first instance was actually 2 years earlier at South Carolina State College. We covered this case last season. It's episode 47 for anyone who wants to go back and give it a listen. But since it was a historically Black college, the tragedy got very little press. And what little attention it did receive was later overshadowed by the events that we're about to discuss. So I'm glad that we covered that one as well. While South Carolina State College students had been protesting segregation, Kent students were focusing on a different agenda, the Vietnam War. The U.S. had been involved in Vietnam politics since the early 1950s. But when ground troops were sent to the province of Da Nang in 1965, much of the American public was not supportive, particularly college-aged young people. Several campus protests against the Vietnam War erupted between 1965 and 1969 at the universities of Michigan, Berkeley, and Columbia. The death toll overseas was intense, with as many as 49 U.S. soldiers dying a day in 1968. And in 1969, the public learned about the My Lai massacre, where U.S. Army soldiers slaughtered over 400 Vietnamese civilians, including children and babies. They reportedly also gang-raped many of the women prior to the massacre and mutilated the bodies afterwards, which heightened the anger so many Americans already felt at the U.S. military's involvement. By the dawn of 1970, then-President Richard Nixon was elected on a platform that promised he would end the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. However, instead of pulling out, on the night of April 30th, 1970, Nixon gave a televised announcement that he was invading Cambodia in order to disrupt enemy supply lines. While the move was described as a way to end the Vietnam War, it was the exact opposite of what everyone had expected, especially since Nixon also simultaneously introduced a bill that removed college attendance as a valid reason for draft deferment. I think that was a really shocking move.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I knew that it happened, but I somehow didn't put it together that Nixon was responsible for that. This outraged college students who were already angry, and their feelings only escalated after Nixon referred to student protesters as, quote, bums blowing up college campuses the day following his announcement. College protests flared across the country, with one at Ohio State University turning particularly violent as dissenting students clashed with police. But in the blue-collar town of Kent, around 3 hours away from Ohio's largest college, no one could have predicted that a deadly protest was about to break out at their hometown university. And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Tired of your car insurance rate going up, even with a clean driving record? You're not alone. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/Libsyn today. That's JERRY.ai/LIBSYN.
On the afternoon of Friday, May 1st, around 500 Kent students rallied on their campus's Commons lawn in protest of the Cambodia invasion. They buried a copy of the Constitution to symbolize that Nixon had killed the Constitution by declaring an act of war before consulting with Congress. Several students also nailed a sign to a nearby tree that read, "Why is the ROTC building still standing?" Local townspeople were shocked by this, as Kent State was viewed by outsiders as a working-class university. Most students were from the surrounding counties, went home on weekends, and the school tended to attract young people who didn't act radically in the way students from politically liberal universities like Berkeley and Columbia were portrayed. But that wasn't actually true. Kent State had staged a few large protests before, and much of the dissent was led by a student group called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. While Kent had a chapter of this group on campus, SDS was a much larger national organization with chapters at several colleges across the country. Think similar to a fraternity, but for political activism instead of Greek life. The National SDS began at the University of Michigan in 1960, and by 1962, they'd grown to 9 chapters across the U.S. and hosted about 1,000 members. And while SDS originally had no interest in protesting the war, they were looking more towards racial equality and eliminating poverty. This changed in 1964 after Lyndon B. Johnson won the presidential election and sent U.S. ground troops to Vietnam. SDS found that students cared far less about equality and poverty in the face of their friends being shipped off to war. So this is when the organization pivoted their focus to anti-war protests and activities. By 1969, only a year before the Kent State tragedy, SDS had over 300 chapters, and the organization had grown large enough and loud enough that it got national media attention. Just for a little more background, National SDS led a college campaign called 10 Days of Resistance in 1968 that involved hundreds of teach-ins, sit-ins, and a walkout on April 18th, 1968, where over 1 million students nationwide left class to protest the war. But their biggest stunt that year was a full student shutdown of Columbia University, which got them on the news. So they were big. And while most of the SDS events were peaceful protests, things got a little extreme at Kent in 1969 when the school's SDS chapter occupied one of the university's administration buildings with a list of demands, one of which was to abolish the school's ROTC program, as it was seen as a student-to-soldier pipeline feeding the war effort.
Do you know what any of the other demands were? I know that was the primary one, but...
I think the demands basically centered around war-like activities. I'm not sure exactly what they were, but they involved the school pulling back. So whether it was the ROTC program or other possible shows of support, I believe this was what the demands focused around. The administration called in local police force instead of meeting the demands, and a scuffle broke out between law enforcement and the students. In the end, the protest leaders were formally disciplined by the school for inciting violence, which is pretty interesting. A few weeks following the incident, while the protest leaders were in a disciplinary hearing, a riot broke out between other STS members and counter-protesters outside the courthouse. So things are escalating here. 58 people were arrested afterwards, and the STS members received 6-month jail sentences for assault and battery.
I think it would be longer, actually.
Well, I mean, it was a protest, and I don't know what level of violence there was.
Yeah.
So think about it. Maybe not if it's like, when we talk about like simple assaults, probably not, right? Okay. But this violence placed both university administration and the local government in opposition to SDS, and the townspeople of Kent began labeling any young person who opposed the war as dangerous. While some of these beliefs may have been due to the fact that Kent was a quiet, blue-collar area that valued law-abiding behavior, a larger reason was because one of the SDS national chapters actually was dangerous. So, known as the Weather Underground or Weathermen, they were domestic terrorists who incited riots in Washington, D.C. in 1969 and bombed over 20 government buildings in the winter of 1970. I mean, so there's they have reason to be afraid here. While the Weather Underground was never affiliated with Kent's chapter of SDS, their violent acts definitely colored local opinions about what those students were capable of. So when students buried a copy of the Constitution on May 1st, an air of uneasiness descended around the campus, and it flowed into the town. Many people who were interviewed recalled that the weekend following President Nixon's announcement was the first warm spring weather day after a brutally cold Midwestern winter. I have to say we can relate to that, even though it's brutally cold here at times, right? Everyone was itching to get out and party, and by 10 p.m. that Friday evening, Kent's 6 downtown bars were packed with not just university students looking for a cold beer and a good time, but also tons of local youth. If you recall, the drinking age was 18 at that time. And also a large out-of-town motorcycle gang was out for fun that evening as well.
Sounds like we have a lot of people mixing from different backgrounds, alcohol involved, tensions are high because of what's going on.
Sounds like a recipe for
something's
disaster.
about to,
I mean, most people were out for a fun night, but several students were still amped up about Nixon's announcement. And around 11 p.m., someone had set a trash barrel on fire outside of one of the bars. And the fire attracted a crowd of drunken students and bikers who started talking about the war. As more and more students gathered, conversation turned to a mobbed anger, and anti-war chants filled the air. Within minutes, the drunk students were blocking streets in the downtown and trapping motorists in their cars. One instance in particular involved an elderly couple who got stopped at the traffic light across from the bars. Students surrounded their car, banged on their windows, demanding to know how they felt about Cambodia, and when they didn't answer, several young men climbed on the car and started rocking it back and forth, terrifying the couple inside. Kent police were called to break up the crowd, but their patrol cars were hit with a volley of beer bottles, and reinforcements from other agencies had to be called in. There were only something like 10 officers on duty at the time, just for some context here. By 11:30 p.m., the downtown was engulfed by a mob. The drunk students broke the storefront windows of all the downtown businesses, stole items out of the displays, and injured several police officers with thrown rocks and broken beer bottles. Some of the crowd broke off, diving into local restaurants and claiming they'd taken over Main Street and that they were taking over the campus next. By midnight, the mob had trashed 15 businesses, and the mayor declared a state of emergency, closing down all the bars.
Now, this mob consisted of both students, those from that biker group, and also locals.
That's correct.
Okay.
Mixed mob here. Declaring a state of emergency only escalated the issue, though, as it let another 500 or so drug people out of the bars and onto the streets.
Oh, no, they didn't think that through. But then again, what else would they have done? Maybe like a shelter in place?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. By 1 a.m., the entire Kent Police Department and a contingent of Portage County deputies deployed tear gas to disperse the crowds and chase students back up to the campus. By 2 a.m., the mob was gone and 15 students had been arrested. But in the eerie quiet that followed, the mayor contacted Ohio's Governor Jim Rhodes and told him that SDS had destroyed Kent's downtown and had, quote, taken over a portion of the town. Now, there's no documentation that SDS was involved. Based on later eyewitness accounts, the riot happened organically and no one person or group had instigated it. But the FBI had alerted Kent's police department a few years prior that radicals were targeting universities, and Kent was on the list. So when SDS staged their protest that Friday afternoon, the town administration was certain SDS was the culprit. And while the students had never actually taken over, the downtown business owners were terrified the students would return on Saturday and cause more property damage. And certainly you cannot blame them for that. With such a real possibility of continued unrest, Governor Rhodes felt it best to call on the National Guard to assess the Kent situation. I always wonder how things would have gone differently had the Guard not been called in. Certainly what happened might not have, but maybe there would have been different consequences. Maybe there would have still been a riot.
It seems like that's the point where things could have gone a different direction.
Yeah. So the National Guard was nearby providing highway security in Akron, Ohio. So a Guard representative arrived the following morning for a meeting between town officials, local police, and the governor. Rumors had been running around the school following Friday's protest that students were targeting the ROTC building, the town post office, and the local Army recruiting station. Local businessmen also reported that they'd been threatened by students the following evening that their stores would be set on fire if they didn't display anti-war slogans in their front windows. The damage already done to the downtown convinced Kent's mayor that radical protesters had indeed invaded the college and the town was in immediate danger. To that end, he decreed that no liquor, firearms, or gasoline would be sold until further notice. People could gas up their cars, but that was the only exception. He also enacted a townwide curfew from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. and a university curfew of 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. But town administrators were still concerned that local law enforcement wouldn't be able to handle a violent crowd if all 20,000 of Kent's students invaded the town. Calling in the National Guard felt like the best option. And at 5 p.m., Governor Rhodes officially requested a cadre be sent to Kent. It's important to note that the governor had deployed the National Guard over 40 times in his 2 years in office, so it wasn't really surprising that he chose this option. Meanwhile, university students began congregating near the on-campus ROTC building that same evening, shouting anti-war chants and slogans. By 8 p.m., the crowd had ballooned to around 1,000 people, though reports cite that most of the students had come to see what was going on and weren't actually part of the protest. Regardless, about 30 minutes into the protest, several people picked up rocks and broke the windows out of the building. The rocks were followed by some lit flares, which whipped up the crowd, and in a few minutes, the building had caught fire. The local fire department arrived not long after to put out the flames, but around 15 protesters intercepted the firemen, cutting their hoses with a machete and knives.
Whoa. I don't think I realized this part.
No.
The narrative seems to focus more on the response to this activity, but this activity is not something I have heard.
Because we didn't have like the full context until you do the full research and deep dive, right? Just so you know, the machete had actually been purchased by an art student for a sculpture class they were enrolled in and not for purposes of actually cutting this. The professor later said on record that he specifically required machetes for a tool in this class.
Okay.
But with no backup and no hoses, the firemen left quickly and the ROTC building blazed. As the protesters continued their anti-war slogans in the light of the burning building, the Ohio National Guard rolled into Kent at 10 p.m. Reports handed to them from the governor's office detailed a threat of over 1,000 armed and dangerous students who had already taken over parts of the town. Coupled with the potential threat of a domestic terrorist group like the Weathermen, the Guard arrived with 138 trucks, 7 armored tanks, 3 armored tanks with mortar launches, 4 armored command vehicles, 13 helicopters, 4 airplanes, and 1,000 ground troops armed with M1 Garand rifles and bayonets.
Okay, so what do we think about this response?
It's heavy. I mean, it's a really heavy response. You know, it's easy to look back now and say, well, this shouldn't have happened, whatnot. But fact is, too, we weren't on the ground and don't know what the tensions were like and don't know how scared both sides might have felt or anxious. You know, we weren't on the ground, but also the National Guard, they don't have non-lethal response. They
didn't at that point.
Well, that's not how they're militarized. So the gear that they have is the gear that they have, and it's not the same as the in-between gear, you know, tasers or pepper spray. I mean, they have some of that, but really they have heavy artillery because that's what they're anticipating they need to respond back then. And things did not start calmly between the Guard and the students, as you can probably have imagined. Upon the Guard's arrival, they intercepted a group of students who were leaving campus to protest downtown. Since this was after the town's 8 p.m. curfew, the Guard deployed tear gas and charged the students with their bayonets to force them back on campus. Protesters responded by throwing rocks and urine-filled glass bottles at the troops, along with taunting them, giving them the middle finger, and several male protesters dropped their pants and shook their genitals. In another instance, a group of students held a white T-shirt aloft like a flag, saying they just wanted to speak with a Guard commander. In the hopes that de-escalation could be reached, the Guard captain had his troops stand down and let the students approach. But when they got close enough, they threw palm-sized rocks at the Guard instead. Several similar encounters happened across campus as the Guard ordered protesters to disperse. It was midnight before all the protests had been quelled, and the campus reeked of tear gas while helicopters roared overhead. By this point, the ROTC building had burned to the ground. Kent State's president was taking an emergency flight back to the school. He was at an out-of-state conference, and Governor Rhodes was also en route. And for the majority of the 20,000 students enrolled at the time, nothing about their current situation made sense. It's been estimated that while there were around 1,000 or so students protesting, they only made up about 5% of the whole student body, which meant that most students on this night were either just returning to campus from a weekend at home when the Guard arrived, or they had been doing some late-night studying for upcoming finals while the Guard clashed with protesters across the campus. Most had no idea what was going on. And those that did only showed up because they were intrigued to see what all the fuss was about, which we can probably understand. But as students settled into their dorms after a turbulent Saturday, 2 rumors were running through the halls. One was that a bigger protest was going to happen on the campus commons at noon on Monday, and 2, that there was nothing to fear from the Guard. Their rifles were just for show, and they weren't loaded. Out of these 2 rumors, only one would turn out to be true.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
The morning to midday of Sunday, May 3rd, was a tense, quiet one in Kent, as the Guard stood watch at every entrance and building around the campus, and students either actively avoided them or carefully tried to make polite conversation. The Guard was made up of 2 groups. older men who'd retired out of active military duty and seen combat, and young men around the same age as the students who'd used joining the Guard as a way to escape being shipped to Vietnam. Seems ironic in some ways.
Yeah, that they ended up being thrown into a war anyway, right?
Exactly. A war at home, right?
Yep.
For many in the Guard, they actually agreed with the student protesters about their anti-war sentiments, and this led to an uneasy peace for the first part of the day. There's photographs of this day showing female students putting flowers in the tips of the guardmen's rifles and both parties laughing together. Other pictures captured the Guard and students hanging out together on the commons or under the shade of nearby trees.
It's almost like the calm before the storm, right?
Yes, but things began to escalate again when Governor Rhodes arrived at Kent in the late afternoon and went immediately to the local fire station to give a press conference. In it, he said the following to a locally broadcasted network. We've seen here at the city of Kent the most vicious form of campus-oriented violence yet perpetrated by a dissident group. This now is the problem of the state of Ohio, and I want to assure you that we're going to employ every force of law to get to the bottom of the situation here at Kent. The same group we are dealing with here today have only one thing in mind, and that is to destroy higher education in Ohio. Last night, I think we have seen all forms of violence, the worst. We're going to use every part of law enforcement in Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We have the same groups going away from one college to another, and they use a university, state-supported by taxpayers of Ohio, as a sanctuary. We're going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms. They just move from one campus to another and terrorize a community. They are worse than the brown shirts, the communist elements, and also the night riders. They're the worst kind of people we harbor in America. But I want to say they're not going to take over Kent State's campus. It's over with in Ohio. So this was a speech that had to ignite the flame. It was a changing point, I think. And for any of our listeners who want to read the whole speech, we'll have a link to it in our show notes. In addition to what I read here, Rhodes also called on the Ohio legislature to recodify the throwing of rocks and other debris at law enforcement as a felony and to waive due process for any protesters arrested for such acts. Though as far as I could find, the Ohio legislature did not change their laws at the time. Rhodes also declared a state of emergency following the speech, though later records revealed he never filed the appropriate paperwork to legalize this. And due to that, there was a severe breakdown in the chain of command for the events that followed. As Sunday evening approached, a message was sent over Kent State's campus radio that students were no longer allowed to congregate in groups of more than 2 people, or they would be charged with unlawful assembly under the Ohio Riot Act. Now, as far as I could find, there was no Ohio Riot Act on the books in 1970. Ohio did have a military code in which participation in a riot was punishable under the Code of Military Justice, but I wasn't able to find if that's what's being referred to in this instance or not.
Curious what the actual definition is, because that's pretty subjective, right? How do you define a riot?
Participation in a riot, they definitely had something, a description of that.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, it seemed to me that they're referencing an act that was not an act, that was not established.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, the announcement only seemed to make student protesters determined to congregate, especially after the speech that Rhodes gave downtown where he compared them to Nazis. As the sun set on Kent, hundreds of students began gathering on the commons in front of the campus's main building. And in an effort to force disbursement, local authorities recommended that the National Guard change the campus curfew from 1 a.m. to 9 p.m. So students were told that due to the governor's state of emergency, the curfew had changed and they had 5 minutes to disperse before measures would be taken. According to some reports, students were not even given the full 5 minutes before guardsmen shot tear gas into the crowd and herded students towards the dorms with their bayonets. In later interviews, ex-guardsmen explained their behavior in two ways. The first was that after the difficulty they'd had in gaining compliance the night before and getting injured with rocks, they were not going to show any leniency to the students. The second was that the guard had been working another detail prior to Kent, and they'd been sleeping in 3-hour shifts for almost a week by the time they arrived there. Once in Kent, they were sleeping on a gymnasium floor at the local elementary school. Their commanders demanded meeting violence with violence, and they were exhausted, angry, and basically had no more bandwidth for the protesters. But students refused to comply, with the group breaking away and holding an impromptu sit-in at the front gates of the university. They told the guard that they wouldn't leave unless they'd met with Kent's mayor and the university's president to discuss a list of their demands. The students were informed that both the mayor and president would come shortly to discuss things. And by all accounts, the sit-in was peaceful until around 11 p.m. But when no one showed up around 11:30, students began to get angry. The guard restated the 9 p.m. curfew, which they'd long violated, and chased them back to the dorms with bayonets and tear gas. In later interviews, students explained this, inciting intense anger across the campus. And even students who hadn't felt strongly about protesting were now pissed off and determined to get the guard off campus in retaliation. As Sunday turned to Monday, Kent State had become a powder keg. Students would later recall that the campus felt like a war zone as tear gas filtered in through their windows and soldiers swarmed the parking lots and campus pathways. But as many of them sat on their beds listening to the drone of helicopter blades and the shouts of the guard outside, flyers pinned to the hallway bulletin boards appeared, reminding them of the rumor that had spread the night before. An anti-war rally was scheduled for Monday at noon in sheer defiance of the Ohio Riot Act and anything else the guard was decreeing. They didn't know it yet, but their choice to attend that rally and its subsequent aftermath would send ripples through the entire country for decades. And that's where we're ending today. In our final episode of Season 4, we'll cover the tragic events of that fateful Monday and the chaotic aftermath that followed. Thank you for listening, and we hope everyone returns with us in 2 weeks for Part 2 of the Kent State shootings.
Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Meghan Sachs and Dr. Amy Shlosberg, with research and writing by Abagail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/CampusKillings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.